For decades, Mel Brooks made the world laugh, hiding sharp truths behind humor so bold it felt fearless. But behind the jokes, the parodies, and the legendary punchlines, there was one relationship that left a permanent scar. While Brooks rarely spoke about personal grudges, those closest to him knew there was one man he truly despised, more than rivals, critics, or industry enemies. And the reason was not petty jealousy or creative disagreement. It was something far deeper, far more personal. Hollywood has never been short on egos, but Mel Brooks built his career on collaboration, loyalty, and trust. When that trust was broken, it cut deeper than any professional setback. What the public never saw were the quiet moments of resentment, the bitterness masked by laughter, and the deliberate silence Brooks chose instead of confrontation. He didn't shout. He didn't expose. He simply erased that person from his world and from his stories. For years, fans speculated about feuds, rivalries, and behind-the-scenes drama, but Brooks never confirmed anything. Now, with time and distance, the truth is clearer than ever. This wasn't about comedy. It wasn't about fame. It was about betrayal, creative control, and a line that was crossed once and never forgiven. This is the untold story of the one man Mel Brooks truly hated more than anyone. And why even a comedy legend has limits when it comes to loyalty. Mel Brooks built his life around laughter. But few people understood how seriously he took loyalty. To the public, he was the master of satire, a man who mocked power, ego, and hypocrisy with fearless joy. Behind the scenes, however, Brooks was deeply principled. He believed comedy worked best when trust existed between collaborators, when respect was mutual, and when egos stayed secondary to the work. When that balance was broken, it left a wound that humor could not heal. Early in his career, Brooks learned the value of collaboration through struggle. He came up in an industry that was unforgiving, competitive, and often ruthless. Writers stole credit, executives rewrote history, and friendships were treated as temporary conveniences. Brooks survived by choosing his circle carefully. Once he trusted someone, he trusted them completely. That trust, once given, was not easily earned again if broken. The man Brooks would later come to despise entered his life during a period of creative momentum. At first, the partnership seemed ideal. Ideas flowed freely, laughter came easily, and success followed quickly. Outsiders saw chemistry and assumed friendship. What they didn't see was the imbalance forming quietly in the background, the subtle shifts in credit, the quiet power plays, the moments where boundaries were tested and then crossed. Brooks noticed it first in small ways. A joke repeated without acknowledgement. A meeting where decisions were made without his input. A narrative beginning to form that placed someone else at the center of work Brooks had shaped from the ground up. He didn't confront it immediately. Brooks believed in patience, in giving people room to correct themselves. He assumed misunderstanding before malice, but patterns don't lie. Over time, the behavior became harder to ignore. What once felt like collaboration began to feel like appropriation. Brooks watched as the public story shifted, interviews framed differently. Credits subtly rearranged, influence quietly rewritten. It wasn't just professional irritation. It felt personal. Comedy to Brooks was an extension of identity. Taking ownership of his work felt like taking ownership of his voice. What hurt most was not ambition but betrayal. Brooks had opened doors, shared ideas, defended this person in rooms where reputations were decided. That loyalty was returned with calculation. There were no explosive arguments, no public fallouts. The fracture happened silently, through choices that revealed character more clearly than words ever could. Brooks began to withdraw. He stopped pitching ideas freely. He stopped correcting the record publicly. Instead, he made a decision that would define the rest of the relationship. He would never give this person access to his creative trust again. In Hollywood, where grudges are often loud and theatrical, Brooks chose something far more severe: complete erasure. Friends noticed the shift. Names that were once spoken casually were never mentioned again. Projects moved forward without familiar collaborators. When asked directly, Brooks deflected with humor, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. This was not a temporary disagreement. It was a line crossed permanently. For Mel Brooks, hatred did not look like rage. It looked like finality. He did not seek revenge or public vindication. He simply removed the person from his creative universe entirely. To Brooks, forgiveness was possible, but forgetting betrayal was not. This was only the beginning of the fracture. What followed would reshape how Brooks approached partnerships, power, and trust for the rest of his legendary career. As Mel Brooks' career continued to rise, the absence of that former collaborator became more noticeable not to the public, but to those who knew him well. Brooks had not exploded, had not demanded apologies or public corrections. Instead, he had drawn a firm, invisible boundary. In an industry fueled by noise and ego, his silence spoke volumes. The man he once trusted no longer existed in his professional vocabulary, and that erasure was deliberate. Brooks believed that creative partnerships were sacred. Comedy, in his eyes, was built on vulnerability, on the willingness to share unfinished thoughts, risky jokes, and personal instincts before they were ready for the world. Once that vulnerability was exploited, it could never be restored. He had learned this lesson the hard way. The betrayal hardened him, not into bitterness but into caution. From that point forward, access to his ideas became a privilege, not a given. Behind the laughter and success, Brooks became far more selective. Meetings were shorter. Collaborations were tested before they were trusted. He watched closely how people treated credit, power, and recognition. The wound had taught him that ambition without integrity was dangerous, and he refused to let it touch his work again. A man he hated continued to exist in Hollywood circles, occasionally intersecting with Brooks' orbit. Invitations were declined. Conversations were avoided. When paths crossed publicly, Brooks remained courteous but cold. There was no reconciliation, no shared nostalgia. What once might have been friendship had calcified into something immovable. Those who asked about it were met with deflection or humor, but never explanation. Brooks understood that explaining betrayal often gives it more power than it deserves. Privately, however, the impact lingered. Brooks questioned his own judgment, replaying moments where he had ignored early warning signs. He wondered whether generosity had been mistaken for weakness, whether trust had been extended too freely. These thoughts did not consume him, but they shaped him. They changed how he measured people, how he weighed intention against outcome. Comedy became his refuge. If betrayal had taken something from him, humor gave it back. Brooks poured his experiences into satire, into characters who mocked arrogance and exposed hypocrisy. Laughter for him was not escapism, it was resistance. It was his way of reclaiming control in a world that had briefly undermined him. What separated this grudge from others in Hollywood was its permanence. Brooks did not forgive for the sake of peace. He believed forgiveness required accountability, and accountability had never come. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, only silence and rewritten narratives. That, to Brooks, confirmed everything. You do not reconcile with someone who refuses to recognize harm. Friends later noted that. Brooks' greatest anger was not loud, it was principled. He did not hate impulsively. He hated with clarity. Once a line was crossed, it was final. The man he truly despised was not remembered for talent or success, but for violating something Brooks considered sacred, creative honesty. Years passed and the industry moved on. New stars emerged. New partnerships formed. Yet the lesson remained embedded in Brooks' approach to work and life. He became fiercely protective of those who earned his trust, and utterly unreachable to those who broke it. That distinction defined his later years more than any feud ever could. By the time Brooks reached the height of his legacy, the grudge had become less about anger and more about principle. It wasn't about punishment, it was about self-respect. And in that quiet, unyielding resolve, Mel Brooks made it clear, some betrayals are not meant to be healed. As the years passed. Mel Brooks rarely spoke the man's name, but the absence itself became a statement. In Hollywood, where history is constantly rewritten by whoever speaks the loudest, Brooks chose something far more unsettling: silence. He did not correct false narratives. He did not reclaim credit publicly. He let time do the work, believing that truth, if left alone long enough, eventually surfaces on its own. But that decision came at a cost. There were moments when Brooks watched interviews or read retrospectives that subtly minimized his role, reshaping creative history in ways that stung more than he expected. He never reacted outwardly, but privately, it reinforced his resolve. The betrayal was no longer theoretical. It had consequences. Ideas he had nurtured were now attributed elsewhere. and audiences accepted the revised version without question. Brooks understood then that betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly, it often arrives as erasure. Despite this, Brooks refused to allow resentment to define him. Instead, he refined his sense of control. He became fiercely independent, structuring his projects so that authorship could never again be blurred. Contracts were clearer. Credits were airtight. Power was centralized, not out of ego, but protection. If trust could not be guaranteed, then clarity would be. The man he hated tried indirectly to reopen the door. Messages were passed through intermediaries. Invitations were extended under the guise of nostalgia. Brooks declined them all. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just definitively. To Brooks, reconciliation without accountability was meaningless. Apologies that arrived too late or through someone else carried no weight. The damage had already been done. What made this hatred different from others was its emotional precision. Brooks did not hate impulsively or irrationally. He hated because he remembered clearly. He remembered who stood beside him when success was uncertain and who shifted position when success became valuable. That memory hardened into certainty. The man had not simply taken credit, he had revealed his character. As Brooks aged, his perspective sharpened rather than softened. Time did not blur the offense. It clarified it. Distance stripped away excuses. What remained was a simple truth. Trust once broken at the core can never be rebuilt. Brooks no longer felt anger, but he also felt no obligation to forgive. Forgiveness, he believed, was a gift, not a duty. Interestingly, the hatred never consumed him. Brooks continued to laugh, to create, to mentor others. He poured generosity into collaborators who proved themselves worthy. But the lesson never faded. He warned younger creatives quietly, advising them to protect their ideas and value integrity over access. Hollywood, he knew, rewarded proximity to power but integrity, determined longevity. Those closest to Brooks noticed that the betrayal reshaped how he measured success. Awards mattered less. Legacy mattered more. He cared deeply about how history would remember his work, not for dominance, but for honesty. The man he despised would never be allowed to rewrite that history again, at least not within Brooks' control. The public, of course, never saw this internal reckoning. They saw laughter, irreverence, confidence. What they didn't see was the boundary beneath it all, a line drawn once and never erased. Brooks did not need vengeance. His refusal to engage was punishment enough. By this point in his life, Mel Brooks had made peace with everything except one thing: betrayal without accountability. That, he believed, deserved no redemption arc. And in the quiet certainty of that belief, the hatred endured, not loud, not dramatic, but unbreakable. In the final stretch of his life and career, Mel Brooks no longer felt the need to justify his silence. Time had done what confrontation never could. It had clarified everything. At an age where memory becomes precious and selective, Brooks' recollection of the betrayal remained sharp, not because he clung to it, but because it had shaped him. Some moments become permanent not through obsession, but through consequence. Brooks came to understand that hatred in his case was not rooted in anger, but in principle. He did not wake up resentful or bitter. He woke up resolved. The man he truly hated was not someone who had wronged him casually, but someone who had violated a core value: creative honesty. In Brooks' world, humor was sacred because it required vulnerability. To exploit that vulnerability was unforgivable. As he reflected on his legacy, Brooks felt no regret about cutting the man out of his life completely. There were no unresolved conversations weighing on him, no words left unsaid. The silence was intentional and it was complete. Reconciliation, he believed, would have required acknowledgement, humility, and truth. None of those ever arrived. And without them, reopening the door would have been a betrayal of himself. What Brooks did feel, however, was gratitude for the lesson. The experience taught him how to protect others. In his later years, he became a quiet guardian of creative integrity, offering guidance to younger writers and performers. He urged them to guard their ideas, to value collaboration, and to recognize that loyalty matters more than access. He didn't share names or details. He didn't need to. The warning itself carried weight. The man he despised faded into the background of Brooks' story, not erased from history. but stripped of influence over his emotional world. Brooks understood that hatred only becomes destructive when it consumes attention. His did not. It remained contained, controlled, and purposeful. It reminded him of boundaries, not bitterness. As audiences celebrated Brooks for his brilliance, few realized how much discipline it took to remain generous in an industry that rewarded exploitation. His laughter was genuine, but it was also earned. It came from someone who had been tested and had chosen integrity over comfort. That choice, more than any feud or success, defined him. In the end, Mel Brooks did not want revenge. He wanted truth. And when truth was denied, he chose distance. That distance protected his spirit, his work, and his sense of self. He lived with clarity, not closure, and for him, that was enough. This is why Mel Brooks truly hated him more than anyone. Not because of ego, rivalry, or fame, but because some betrayals reveal who a person really is. And once that truth is known, it cannot be laughed away.